In the cold darkness before dawn on December 16, 1944, a United States Army colonel stood facing one of the most consequential decisions any field commander would make during the entire European campaign. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson commanded the 406th Artillery Group, and through the lenses of his field glasses he was watching something deeply troubling unfold along the German-Belgian frontier near the town of Monschau. German forces were gathering in numbers that suggested something far more serious than routine patrol activity. What Axelson was witnessing was the preliminary movements of what Adolf Hitler had designated Operation Watch on the Rhine, though Allied intelligence hadn't yet grasped the full scope of what was coming. History would remember it differently, calling it the Battle of the Bulge, and it would prove to be Nazi Germany's final major offensive operation in the Western theatre. The situation confronting Axelson was deteriorating rapidly. The 38th Cavalry Squadron held defensive positions along what would become the northern shoulder of the German penetration, and they were about to face overwhelming force. His operations officer approached with urgent news that German artillery preparation had begun, and the cavalry unit was requesting immediate fire support. Axelson understood the tactical picture clearly enough. What complicated his decision were the wooden crates stacked nearby, each one marked with classified designations that most American officers had never seen. These containers held artillery shells designated T-98 Posit, ammunition that incorporated technology so sensitive that standing orders from the highest levels of Allied command explicitly forbade their employment over land under any circumstances. The shells represented something extraordinary in military technology. Inside each projectile was a miniaturized radio transmitter, a device that would measure the shell's distance from the ground and trigger detonation at precisely 30 feet of altitude. This wasn't the traditional impact fuse that had been standard artillery equipment for decades. Instead, these proximity-fused rounds would explode in the air above enemy positions, creating a lethal cone of steel fragments that made traditional defensive earthworks essentially useless. The technology was so closely guarded that German intelligence had no concrete knowledge of its existence, and most American commanders remained unaware of the program. Axelson gave the order to load the VT shells, using the deliberately misleading code designation that stood for variable time, a phrase designed to confuse enemy intelligence officers if they intercepted American communications. Within 47 minutes of that unauthorized decision, German ground forces would encounter a weapon that would fundamentally alter the final months of the European war. The physics of what these shells could accomplish was straightforward but devastating. Traditional artillery shells that detonated on impact sent roughly half their fragments into the earth itself, wasting explosive potential on dirt and rock. Another 45% of the fragments travelled outward in horizontal patterns that soldiers in foxholes could largely avoid by staying below ground level. Only about 5% of the lethal energy went upward. The proximity fuse inverted this geometry entirely. Detonating 30 feet above the surface meant that 100% of the fragments travelled either downward or outward in an expanding cone. More importantly, these fragments arrived at angles between 30 and 45 degrees, perfectly aligned to penetrate foxholes, trenches, and rifle pits. A soldier who had dug himself into the earth seeking protection found that protection transformed into a trap. The lethal radius expanded from roughly 25 yards for conventional ground burst to 60 yards for airburst, and the area covered by lethal fragments increased from about 60 square feet to 3,000 square feet, a 50-fold improvement in effectiveness. The shells themselves contained technology that German scientists had publicly declared impossible to achieve. Each projectile nose held 4 vacuum tubes, not the 5 sometimes incorrectly reported in popular accounts, forming a complete miniature radio station compressed into a space smaller than a standard coffee cup. These components had been hardened to withstand acceleration forces of 20,000 times normal gravity, forces that would literally liquefy human tissue. The device operated as both transmitter and receiver, sending out radio waves and detecting the echo that bounced back from the ground surface. When the return signal indicated the correct altitude, the fuse would trigger detonation. The entire system was elegantly simple in concept, but represented impossibly complex engineering in execution. Manufacturing each unit required approximately 130 precision components, many manufactured to tolerances measured in millionths of an inch. The assembly took place in clean rooms, performed by workers who often had no idea what they were building or how it would be used. Development of this weapon system had consumed resources on a staggering scale. The program began in 1940 and eventually cost approximately $1 billion in period currency, equivalent to roughly $15 billion in contemporary economic terms. By late 1943, American industrial facilities were manufacturing 40,000 complete proximity fuses every single day, a production rate that would eventually climb to 70,000 daily units by war's end. British scientific observers who witnessed the technology in operation described it as possibly the most remarkable scientific achievement of the entire conflict. Military historians and official assessments would later rank the proximity fuse as the third most significant technological development of World War II, trailing only radar and the atomic bomb in overall importance. Yet unlike those other technologies, its very existence remained completely unknown to German forces until the moment they began dying beneath its effects. The production statistics revealed the true extent of American industrial supremacy in ways that simple military victories could not. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories manufactured exactly 22,073,481 complete proximity fuses. Of these, 21,630,385 were shipped for combat employment, while 388,324 units were consumed in testing and development. Each individual fuse represented a sophisticated electronic device assembled by hand in environmentally controlled facilities. The workforce dedicated to this single weapons program eventually reached 110,000 workers, most of whom never fully understood what they were producing. The security classifications were so strictly enforced that employees performed individual specialized tasks without seeing the complete assembly process. The technical challenges that engineers had to overcome were formidable. The fuse needed to remain completely inert during handling, storage, and loading to prevent accidental detonation. It had to survive not just the initial acceleration, but also the violent spin imparted by the rifling in the artillery barrel, which could reach 30,000 revolutions per minute. The device needed to function reliably across temperature extremes from -50 in European winter to +120 in Pacific Island heat. It had to operate after months of storage in conditions ranging from humid tropical environments to frozen depots. The power supply problem alone required ingenious engineering. Batteries were too heavy and unreliable. The solution involved a tiny wind-driven generator, essentially a miniature propeller that remained protected during the firing sequence and then extended into the slipstream as the shell flew toward its target. This generator charged capacitors that powered the radio circuit, which operated at frequencies between 180 and 220 MHz. The elegant aspect of this design was that the fuse remained completely inactive until actually fired, making it safe to handle and impossible for enemy forces to detect or jam until the final seconds of flight. The first massive employment of these proximity-fused shells against ground targets commenced at exactly 6:18 hours on December 16, 1944, precisely 47 minutes after German artillery had begun the preparatory bombardment that opened Hitler's offensive. Colonel Axelson's 406th Artillery Group opened fire without any official authorization, responding purely to the immediate tactical emergency developing in front of their positions. General Dwight Eisenhower wouldn't formally request clearance to employ proximity fuses over land until December 19, 3 days later. Complete lifting of all restrictions wouldn't occur until December 21st. But Axelson's unauthorized decision had already introduced the technology to ground combat, and the effects were immediately apparent to anyone observing the battlefield. German infantry advancing through the pre-dawn darkness followed their training when American artillery began falling. They dove for the prepared foxholes and defensive positions they had constructed during their assembly period. This was standard procedure they had executed countless times in multiple theatres of war. But instead of the expected impact detonations that would send most fragments harmlessly into the earth or over their heads, these shells were exploding in the air approximately 30 feet above ground level. The fragments came straight down at angles that rendered foxholes worse than useless, actually concentrating casualties in the places where soldiers had gathered for protection. After-action reports from the 99th Infantry Division documented the effect in clinical language that barely conveyed the horror. VT-fused concentrations on German assembly areas near the town of Krinkelt resulted in what the report termed extraordinary casualties among lead battalions, achieved within 12 minutes of when the fire mission commenced. Enemy medical services were immediately overwhelmed. Advancing units found themselves forced to literally step over their own dead to continue the attack forward. By December 23rd, roughly a week into the battle, military intelligence officers estimated that approximately 2,000 German soldiers had been killed specifically by proximity-fused artillery rounds during the fighting around Malmedy, where American artillery battalions had fired these shells with devastating effect against SS Panzer forces. Some German attackers were reportedly so psychologically unnerved by the experience of artillery that exploded above their heads that they began charging directly forward into the artillery fire itself, shouting the German word for comrade in what appeared to be attempts to surrender. The psychological impact of this weapon exceeded even the physical devastation it inflicted. German soldiers found themselves facing something that violated their understanding of how artillery functioned and how they could protect themselves from it. Understanding why proximity fuses made traditional defensive earthworks obsolete requires examining the physics involved. A conventional high-explosive artillery shell detonating on contact with the ground follows predictable fragment patterns that military engineers had studied for decades. Approximately 50% of all fragments travel downward into the earth, creating a crater but having no effect on enemy personnel. Another 45% travel outward in roughly horizontal patterns that soldiers below ground level can avoid. Only about 5% of fragments travel upward. A soldier in a properly constructed foxhole, perhaps 4 feet deep with overhead cover of logs and earth, enjoyed approximately 90% survival probability from conventional artillery landing nearby. The mathematics changed catastrophically with proximity fuses. Detonating at 30 feet altitude meant every single fragment travelled either downward or outward in the inverted cone pattern already described. The lethal radius increased from 25 yards to 60 yards. More critically, the fragments arrived at steep angles perfectly aligned to enter foxholes, trenches, and rifle pits from above. The lethal fragment area increased from 60 square feet to 3,000 square feet, a 50-fold improvement that rendered traditional field fortifications largely ineffective. This represented not merely an incremental improvement in artillery effectiveness, but a fundamental transformation of how artillery could be employed against infantry formations. The shells themselves stand as monuments to American precision manufacturing capability. The miniaturized components had to function after experiencing forces that would destroy virtually any conventional electronics. The 4 vacuum tubes required special hardening processes that created devices bearing no resemblance to their commercial counterparts. The triode served oscillator and detector functions. The pentode handled amplification. The thyrotron acted as the trigger switch. Occasionally a diode provided rectification, though designs varied. These specially hardened vacuum tubes represented entirely new categories of electronic components developed specifically for this weapons program. The development project reflected American scientific and industrial cooperation operating at peak effectiveness. In August 1940, The British Tizard mission had crossed the Atlantic, bringing with them Britain's most sensitive military secrets, including early radar work and theoretical concepts for proximity fuses. British scientists had proven the theory sound, but completely lacked the industrial capacity to develop and mass-produce such devices. The American National Defense Research Committee, formed in June 1940, designated the proximity fuse as their second highest priority after radar development itself. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory became the primary development center, while American industry began tooling up for eventual mass production. The challenges engineers confronted were truly staggering in scope. The fuse had to withstand 20,000 G forces during barrel acceleration. It needed to function across temperature ranges from -50 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit. It had to maintain stability while spinning at up to 30,000 revolutions per minute. It needed to operate reliably after months of storage in conditions ranging from humid Pacific islands to frozen European depots. The project, codenamed Section T to confuse enemy intelligence, employed 3,000 scientists and engineers at peak staffing levels. They developed entirely new categories of plastics that wouldn't shatter under acceleration forces. They created miniature vacuum tubes capable of withstanding forces that would destroy normal electronics. They pioneered assembly techniques, achieving accuracy measured in 10,000ths of an inch. The first truly successful test occurred on January 29, 1942, when a proximity-fused shell successfully destroyed a drone aircraft flying over Chesapeake Bay. By August 1942, the USS Cleveland had been equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition. The results in naval service were immediately spectacular. Japanese aircraft kill rates increased dramatically when proximity fuses were employed. The USS Helena made naval history on January 5, 1943, shooting down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal using only 4 proximity-fused shells, a remarkably efficient engagement. However, the technology remained deemed too secret for use over land, where enemy forces might recover unexploded shells and potentially reverse-engineer the devices. This restriction held firm until the German offensive in the Ardennes threatened to split Allied forces, compelling field commanders like Colonel Axelson to make unauthorized decisions that would ultimately prove strategically correct. Before their ground deployment, proximity fuses had already proven revolutionary in naval anti-aircraft warfare. Operating at sea eliminated the risk of enemy capture, allowing unrestricted use against Japanese aircraft throughout the Pacific theater. The statistical evidence was compelling beyond dispute. Naval vessels using proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition required an average of 310 rounds to achieve each aircraft kill, compared to 1,162 rounds when using conventional ammunition. By 1944, the USS Helena's proximity-fused shells accounted for 25% of total ammunition fired, but achieved 51% of all aircraft destroyed. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, proximity fuses helped create what American pilots dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, with Japanese aircraft losses exceeding 400 planes in a single engagement. The technology that would soon devastate German infantry had been perfected against Japanese pilots. British forces had begun employing proximity fuses against V-1 flying bombs on June 12, 1944, just days after the Normandy invasion. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the English coast increased their kill rate from 17% to 79% within just 4 weeks of receiving the new ammunition. General Sir Frederick Pyle, who commanded British Anti-Aircraft Command, publicly called it the most remarkable scientific achievement in the entire history of warfare. These successes made the continuing restriction on ground employment increasingly difficult for field commanders to accept. They knew the technology existed and grew increasingly frustrated watching their infantry forces take casualties that proximity fuses could potentially prevent. The Battle of the Bulge crisis finally broke through this bureaucratic obstacle. German intelligence had actually received specific warnings about proximity fuses several months before the Ardennes offensive. In October 1944, General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's staff officers noticed dramatic increases in Luftwaffe losses to Allied anti-aircraft fire across multiple sectors. Technical teams recovered metal fragments from downed aircraft showing unusual scoring patterns that suggested airburst detonation rather than direct impacts. Kesselring's formal report to OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or German Armed Forces High Command, stated that evidence suggested Americans possessed altitude-triggered ammunition of some kind. If this technology could be adapted to ground artillery, the effects on infantry forces would be catastrophic. His report recommended immediate investigation of potential countermeasures. The official response from Berlin, found later in captured German archives, dismissed these concerns entirely. Technical evaluation, the response stated, concluded that proximity detonation under battlefield conditions was impossible to achieve. American anti-aircraft improvements were attributed instead to better radar direction and increased gun density. No action was required. This bureaucratic dismissal would cost the Wehrmacht dearly in the months ahead. German scientists had actually attempted to develop proximity fuses since the early 1930s, creating between 30 and 50 different experimental designs over more than a decade. These included acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound, electrostatic field devices, and radio-based systems similar to what the Americans eventually deployed. None reached operational status before the war ended. Hitler's 1940 directive terminating all weapons development projects that couldn't reach full production within 6 months effectively killed their proximity fuse program at a critical early stage. The profound irony was that during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces actually captured approximately 20,000 intact proximity fuses from overrun American ammunition dumps. They literally held in their hands what could have been the intelligence coup of the entire war, but they never recognized what they possessed. German engineers had concluded such technology was fundamentally impossible due to the massive acceleration forces during artillery firing. They held the physical evidence proving themselves wrong, but lacked the conceptual framework to understand what they were examining. 5 major American corporations conducted final assembly of proximity fuses across multiple facilities. The Crossley Corporation's manufacturing plant in Cincinnati employed 8,000 workers at peak production, manufacturing up to 16,500 proximity fuses daily. Their quality control processes could detect defects measuring 1/50,000th of an inch. The plant consumed more electrical power daily than many entire German cities. Air conditioning systems maintained temperature within 2 degrees Fahrenheit to prevent thermal expansion that might affect manufacturing tolerances. Quality control inspectors rejected 28% of completed units that failed to meet exact specifications. This rejection rate, which would have been absolutely catastrophic for German production planning, was perfectly acceptable to American planners precisely because production volume was so massive. American industry could afford to destroy more precision components daily than Germany managed to produce monthly while still meeting all requirements. Sylvania Corporation dominated component manufacturing, producing 95% of all miniature vacuum tubes, more than 100 million total units, employing 10,000 workers across 15 separate plants dedicated solely to the VT program. More than 100 American companies participated across the entire supply chain, supported by more than 2,000 suppliers ranging from explosive powder manufacturers to precision machine shops. The workforce was predominantly female. At Sylvania's facility in Ipswich, Massachusetts, 9,000 of 10,000 total workers were women, many recruited from local communities with no prior manufacturing experience. They worked in clean rooms with filtered air, using microscopes to verify component placement within tolerances of 0.002 of an inch. Each worker typically performed one highly specific task, repeated thousands of times per shift. The work was repetitive and demanding, but the quality standards were maintained through this entire high-volume production run. By Christmas Day 1944, American artillery batteries had fired approximately 200,000 proximity-fused shells during the ongoing Battle of the Bulge. General George Patton, initially skeptical of the new technology, like many traditional artillery officers, became an enthusiastic convert after witnessing its battlefield effectiveness firsthand. On December 25th and 26th, Patton's Third Army reported killing approximately 700 German soldiers by actual body count at Echternach, using proximity-fused artillery concentrations. His famous assessment, recorded in multiple sources, stated that the funny fuse, as he called it, won the Battle of the Bulge for American forces. This endorsement came from a commander who had previously favoured tanks and mobile warfare over static artillery employment. The psychological impact on German forces was extensively documented through systematic prisoner interrogations conducted by intelligence officers. Captured German soldiers repeatedly described feeling utterly helpless against artillery that exploded overhead with perfect consistency. Traditional defensive training had emphasized taking cover in depressions, foxholes, or trenches whenever artillery fire began. Proximity fuses transformed these protective positions into death traps rather than shelters. One captured German officer told his interrogators that American shells exploded exactly at treetop height, always at precisely the same altitude. His unit tried everything they could conceive, including deeper holes, concrete covers, and maximum dispersal of forces. Nothing worked to reduce casualties. The consistency of the 30-foot detonation height, achieved through precise radio measurement, created a predictability that paradoxically proved more terrifying than random impacts would have been. Soldiers understood that every single shell would detonate at the optimal lethal height with no variation. The Hürtgen Forest battle, which had been raging continuously since September 1944, with horrific casualties on both sides, underwent dramatic transformation when proximity fuses were finally authorized for use on December 18th. The dense forest that had provided German defenders with excellent concealment and overhead cover became instead a multiplier for proximity fuse effectiveness. Tree bursts had always been recognized as deadly, but achieving them deliberately with time-fused shells was extremely difficult and unreliable. Proximity fuses detonated consistently at optimal height, regardless of whether they were flying over open ground or forest canopy. The combination of steel shell fragments and wooden splinters from shattered tree limbs created a lethal storm that no field fortification could withstand. The 4th Infantry Division's artillery batteries fired 12,000 proximity-fused rounds in just the first 48 hours after authorization. The division's official after-action report noted a dramatic increase in enemy casualties and corresponding decrease in German defensive effectiveness. Medical stations began reporting wound patterns they had never encountered before, deep puncture wounds from above, heavily concentrated on shoulders, heads, and upper backs. The Hürtgen Forest essentially became a grim laboratory for understanding proximity fuse effects against entrenched defenders in difficult terrain. Artillery observers noted that German soldiers quickly stopped using traditional foxholes, instead desperately seeking overhead cover in bunkers, cellars, and buildings. This forced them into concentrated positions that became ideal targets for conventional high-explosive shells and direct-fire weapons, creating a tactical dilemma with no satisfactory solution. Any position offering overhead protection from proximity fuses made troops vulnerable to direct assault, while dispersed positions in open terrain left them exposed to the airburst effects. Operation Grenade, the Allied offensive designed to reach the Rhine River, commenced on February 23, 1945. The American Ninth Army fired hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells during just the first week of operations. German defensive positions that had been carefully prepared over months of work proved tragically vulnerable to airburst attack. Wehrmacht headquarters issued increasingly desperate directives attempting to develop effective countermeasures against proximity fuses. A February 10th order required all units to construct foxholes with minimum depth of 2.5 meters, approximately 8 feet, with overhead cover consisting of logs minimum 30 centimetres in diameter covered with 50 centimetres of earth. The February 18th revision mandated that all movement in areas under artillery threat must occur only through covered trenches, and all positions must incorporate concrete or steel overhead protection. These measures were physically impossible to implement under actual combat conditions. The materials required didn't exist, the time needed wasn't available, and the labour couldn't be spared. A February 26th directive essentially gave up on structural solutions, simply ordering that units disperse to maximum distance that combat effectiveness permitted, with no more than 2 men in any single position. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, 1945, illustrated both the immense power and significant limitations of proximity fuses in actual tactical employment. When Lieutenant Karl Timmermann requested artillery support using VT fuses to slow German retreat across the bridge, the artillery battalion commander refused the request, citing reports that American troops were too close to the target area for safe proximity fuse employment. This documented refusal, preserved in official U.S. Army histories, demonstrated that proximity fuses required careful tactical employment protocols to prevent friendly casualties from their wide lethal radius. German attempts to develop their own proximity fuses after discovering their existence revealed the true industrial gap between the combatants. Rheinmetall resumed research in early 1944 and actually test-fired several hundred working prototypes before war's end. But functional prototypes represented an enormous distance from production models ready for combat deployment. German engineers calculated they would need to construct 15 entirely new electronics factories, train 50,000 specialized workers, and develop manufacturing processes that simply didn't exist anywhere in Germany. They would require 500 tons of refined copper monthly, 50 tons of silver for electrical contacts, 2 million precision vacuum tubes annually, and 100,000 skilled workers just to approach American production rates. Even if the materials somehow became available, German industry lacked the precision machine tools required for manufacturing. American factories used Swiss-made microlathes accurate to 1/10,000th of an inch. Germany's best machine tools, worn from 5 years of continuous operation, achieved 1,000th inch accuracy on good days. The quality control requirements alone exceeded German industrial capabilities. The deeper irony was that German scientists understood the underlying theory perfectly well. They had actually begun proximity fuse research before the Americans initiated their program. But understanding theory and achieving mass production represented entirely different challenges. America had not merely developed superior technology, but created an entire industrial ecosystem capable of producing it in millions of units while maintaining exacting quality standards throughout. While proximity fuses transformed ground warfare throughout Europe, their original purpose as anti-aircraft defense reached peak effectiveness in the Pacific Theater by 1945. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells destroyed Japanese aircraft with unprecedented efficiency throughout the final campaigns. The kamikaze threat, which potentially could have made any invasion of the Japanese home islands catastrophically costly in American casualties, was largely neutralized by VT fuses. Naval vessels employing proximity fuses during the Okinawa campaign shot down 91 Japanese aircraft for every 100 attacking, compared to just 25 per 100 before proximity fuses became available. Admiral Willis Lee stated publicly that proximity fuses saved 100,000 American lives in the Pacific Theater. Every Japanese plane shot down by VT fuses, he noted, was one aircraft that didn't crash into American ships. This dual application, devastating against ground forces in Europe while remaining decisive against aircraft in the Pacific, demonstrated American industrial philosophy: mass-produce excellence and deploy it everywhere simultaneously. Germany, struggling desperately to produce even basic ammunition by 1945, faced an enemy that placed sophisticated electronics in disposable artillery shells and expended them without hesitation. Military researchers studying proximity fuse effectiveness in controlled post-war analyses found they were between 3 and 10 times more lethal than conventional artillery when employed against ground targets. Against V-1 flying bombs, destruction rates increased from 24% to 79%. In naval anti-aircraft employment, the average rounds required per aircraft kill dropped from over 1,000 to approximately 300. The 50-fold increase in lethal fragment area fundamentally changed artillery tactical employment doctrine. Traditional artillery doctrine required concentrated barrages to achieve effective area coverage. Proximity fuses allowed dispersed fire to achieve similar or better effects using fewer shells. This improvement cascaded through logistics, reducing ammunition requirements, decreasing barrel wear on artillery pieces, and allowing artillery batteries to support more infantry units simultaneously. General Patton reported that proximity fuses allowed his artillery to support advancing units far more effectively than conventional ammunition. Instead of lengthy preparatory bombardments that gave defenders time to take cover, artillery could fire shorter, more lethal concentrations that allowed infantry to advance before enemies recovered. This increased operational tempo contributed measurably to the rapid Allied advances throughout 1945. However, casualty figures require extremely careful analysis. While various estimates circulated during and immediately after the war, no fully documented evidence supports specific claims of particular large casualty numbers, sometimes attributed solely to proximity fuses. What can be documented conclusively is their dramatic multiplication of artillery effectiveness and their severe psychological impact on German forces. German recognition of proximity fuse technology came gradually and incompletely. Prisoner interrogations revealed that most German soldiers never understood what was killing them. They spoke of tree bursts and air mines, but didn't grasp the systematic technological nature of what they faced. German technical intelligence eventually recognized the sophistication involved in the devices. Captured German technical reports from March 1945 acknowledged that the American proximity fuse represented approximately 5 years' advancement in electronics miniaturization. Replication, these reports stated, would require complete retooling of Germany's electronics industry, access to new materials currently unavailable, and minimum 18 months of development time. The final recommendation stated this was impossible under current wartime conditions. The German military's final situation report, dated May 7, 1945, the day before formal surrender, stated that American artillery employing proximity detonation had inflicted casualties exceeding all other weapons systems combined since December 1944. Countermeasures had proven completely ineffective. The report recommended immediate cessation of hostilities to preserve remaining forces from annihilation by superior technology. The proximity fuse program represented approximately 3% of all American physicists working on a single weapons project. This concentration of scientific talent, combined with virtually unlimited industrial capacity, created production statistics that defied German comprehension. Each production line at Crossley Corporation could assemble 500 complete units per hour. Workers performed individual operations in seconds with microscopic precision thousands of times per shift without significant error rates. The facilities operated 24 hours daily, 7 days per week without interruption. Christmas Day, 1944, saw absolutely no decrease in production output. While German soldiers died under proximity fuse bombardment in the Ardennes forests, American workers maintained maximum production rates. The supply chain stretched across the entire continental United States. Copper came from mines in Montana. Silver came from Treasury Department reserves. Specialized plastics came from chemical companies that literally didn't exist 3 years earlier. The industrial mobilization required was as technically complex as the technology itself. By contrast, German ammunition production in 1945 relied heavily on slave labor working under brutal conditions, producing shells with approximately 60% acceptable quality rates when tested. Sabotage by forced workers reduced effective output even further. By March 1945, only 30% of German artillery shells functioned properly when fired. American proximity fuses with their sophisticated electronics achieved 94% reliability rates despite their complexity. The proximity fuse story encompasses far more than just technology and production statistics. It fundamentally changed the actual battlefield experience for infantry soldiers on both sides of the conflict. American soldiers gained immense confidence knowing their artillery could effectively suppress dug-in enemies, regardless of field fortifications. German soldiers lost the basic psychological security that earth and entrenchments had provided soldiers for centuries of warfare. Veterans' personal accounts from both sides consistently confirm this psychological transformation. American forward observers described calling in fire missions with unprecedented confidence, knowing proximity fuses would affect enemies even in well-prepared positions. German veterans recalled the particular helplessness of hearing incoming artillery and knowing that traditional protective measures offered no real protection. The medical implications proved significant as well. Proximity fuse casualties presented unique challenges that military surgeons hadn't encountered before. The downward angle of fragment penetration created wound patterns unlike anything in previous combat experience. German medical services, already severely strained by 1945, couldn't effectively adapt to these new casualty patterns. American medical personnel, by contrast, had access to penicillin and plasma, advantages that had nothing directly to do with proximity fuses but compounded their overall effectiveness by ensuring that wounded American soldiers received far better care than their German counterparts. The proximity fuse represented more than mere tactical advantage on the battlefield. It demonstrated complete systemic superiority in connecting science, industry, and military application into functional weapons systems. While Germany pursued what they called wonder weapons, like the V-2 rocket, programs that consumed enormous resources for minimal actual military effect, America mass-produced genuinely revolutionary technology and deployed it widely across all theaters. The German Vi-2 program cost approximately $2 billion in equivalent wartime resources and killed approximately 9,000 people, almost all civilians, with no meaningful military impact. The proximity fuse program cost roughly half as much and fundamentally transformed both ground warfare and anti-aircraft defense. This comparison perfectly illustrates fundamentally different approaches to military technology. German emphasis on revolutionary platforms versus American focus on evolutionary improvements manufactured at massive scale. The proximity fuse also validated American organizational methods and management techniques. The close cooperation between Johns Hopkins scientists, industrial manufacturers, and military end users created a development cycle that moved from initial concept to full mass production in less than 3 years. Germany's fragmented research efforts and persistent inter-service rivalries prevented any similar achievement despite having capable scientists and engineers. After Germany's surrender, American technical intelligence teams systematically studied captured German proximity fuse research. They discovered sophisticated theoretical work, but absolutely no viable path to actual production. German scientists clearly understood the basic principles involved, but couldn't overcome the manufacturing challenges. The Rheinmetall prototypes discovered in 1945 were technically sound in design, but used conventional vacuum tubes that couldn't survive artillery shell acceleration forces. German engineers had attempted various hardening techniques but never achieved the reliability of American designs. Even if they had succeeded technically, Germany completely lacked the industrial capacity for mass production by 1945. Soviet forces received limited proximity fuse supplies through Lend-Lease arrangements, but no technical documentation or manufacturing data. Soviet engineers spent 7 full years attempting to reverse engineer captured samples before successfully producing indigenous proximity fuses in 1952. Even then, quality and reliability remained substantially inferior to American wartime production standards. This technological transfer pattern revealed the true complexity of proximity fuse manufacturing. Simply having physical examples wasn't remotely sufficient. Successful production required sophisticated quality control systems and manufacturing expertise that took years to develop even for a nation with Soviet industrial capacity. The proximity fuse story offers several enduring lessons about military innovation that remain relevant today. First, evolutionary improvements to existing weapons systems can prove more operationally decisive than revolutionary new weapons. Proximity fuses were still fundamentally artillery shells, but they transformed artillery effectiveness beyond recognition. Second, mass production capability matters as much as raw technological sophistication. Germany developed jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and advanced submarines, but couldn't manufacture any of them in operationally decisive quantities. America produced 22 million proximity fuses, each one a sophisticated electronic device, and treated them as expendable ammunition. Third, industrial integration and organizational culture determine military capability as much as technical innovation. The proximity fuse required coordinated effort from scientists, manufacturers, and military users. American organizational culture facilitated this integration effectively. German institutional rivalries actively prevented equivalent cooperation. Finally, security and secrecy have genuine operational value but also impose real costs. Restricting proximity fuse use until December 1944 preserved complete tactical surprise, but also meant months of additional Allied casualties that might have been prevented by earlier deployment. This balance between operational security and tactical advantage remains a fundamental challenge in modern military technology development. The proximity fuse raises complex moral questions about technological warfare that deserve serious consideration. It made killing more efficient, more certain, more mathematically precise than traditional warfare. German soldiers in foxholes had absolutely no defense against shells detonating overhead at precisely calculated heights with perfect consistency. This wasn't combat in any traditional sense of individual soldiers testing themselves against opponents. It was industrial slaughter reduced to engineering problems and mathematical solutions. Yet proximity fuses also shortened the war's duration measurably. Every German division destroyed by proximity-fused artillery was one fewer division defending concentration camps and slave labor facilities. The technology that efficiently killed German soldiers also hastened liberation of Nazi victims across occupied Europe. Admiral Louis Strauss, who ranked proximity fuses among the developments upon which Allied victory very largely depended, understood this moral complexity perfectly. American veterans wrestled with these implications throughout their lives. They felt grateful for technology that demonstrably saved American lives, but remained troubled by its devastating effectiveness. Personal accounts describe finding German positions where every single soldier had died simultaneously from airburst fragments, efficient killing that entirely removed human agency from the act of death. The proximity fuse ultimately represented American advantages that transcended any single weapon system. It demonstrated industrial capacity that could mass-produce sophisticated technology, scientific capability that could solve extraordinarily complex problems quickly, and organizational ability to coordinate development and production while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple fronts. When German infantry faced proximity-fused artillery in December 1944, they confronted far more than simply a new weapon. They faced the physical manifestation of American industrial democracy, a system that could conceive, develop, manufacture, and deploy revolutionary technology while simultaneously projecting military power worldwide. Those 30 feet between shell detonation and ground impact represented the gap between American capability and German assumptions about their enemy. In that brief distance, measured by radio waves and timed by miniaturized electronics, lay the fundamental difference between industrial democracy and totalitarian inefficiency. The proximity fuse transformed far more than just World War II combat. It initiated the entire modern age of smart weapons and precision munitions. Contemporary precision-guided munitions trace their direct lineage to the miniaturized electronics first successfully deployed in proximity fuses. The concept of embedding intelligence into ammunition, absolutely revolutionary in 1944, has become standard military practice across all modern armed forces. The specific manufacturing techniques developed for proximity fuse production directly influenced post-war electronics industries. The quality control standards, clean room procedures, and precision assembly methods that made proximity fuses possible became foundational elements for the emerging semiconductor industry. The women who assembled proximity fuses in clean rooms during wartime transitioned into similar roles in post-war electronics manufacturing, bringing their expertise and established procedures into entirely new industries. This historical account relies entirely on verified sources and fully documented evidence. Production figures derive from official Bureau of Ordnance records. Technical specifications come from declassified Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory documents. Battle accounts are drawn from official after-action reports and established military histories. Claims lacking proper documentation have been deliberately excluded from this narrative. No credible evidence supports some specific casualty figures that are sometimes attributed to proximity fuses in popular accounts. Alleged German jamming attempts remain completely unverified in official records. Some frequently repeated accounts appear to be composite narratives assembled from multiple sources rather than documented single events. What remains after rigorous verification is still genuinely remarkable by any measure. The proximity fuse was authentically revolutionary in effect, transforming artillery from an area weapon into a precision system. Its development and subsequent mass production demonstrated American industrial supremacy conclusively. Its tactical employment measurably hastened Allied victory. At 30 feet of altitude, democracy defeated fascism not through superior ideology alone, though America certainly possessed moral advantage, but through the mundane excellence of mass production applied systematically. The proximity fuse, which was nothing more than miniaturized electronics housed in an artillery shell, represented everything Nazi Germany had fundamentally miscalculated about American democracy and industrial capacity. Where German ideology saw weakness in American diversity, America found tremendous strength in industrial mobilization. Jewish scientists who had fled Nazi persecution contributed significantly to proximity fuse development. Women who couldn't serve in direct combat roles assembled the weapons that killed German soldiers by the thousands. Democratic inefficiency, as Germany characterized it, somehow managed to produce 22 million sophisticated electronic devices, while totalitarian efficiency couldn't manufacture even basic ammunition reliably by war's end. The German infantry soldiers who faced proximity fuses in December 1944 were arguably among the world's finest soldiers by any traditional measure. They had conquered most of Europe, fought effectively on multiple fronts simultaneously, and survived years of continuous combat. They died in their foxholes not from any lack of personal courage or tactical skill, but from encountering the future before they understood what was happening. In those 30 feet of distance from airburst to impact, the time it took for fragments to travel from electronic detonation to human flesh, they had just fractions of seconds to recognize that everything they had believed about American weakness was catastrophically wrong. The Third Reich's carefully constructed mythology met American industrial reality in those terminal moments. The proximity fuse destroyed more than German soldiers and military units. It killed the entire mythology of martial racial superiority, destroyed the romance of defensive fortification that had dominated military thinking for generations, and demolished the concept that personal courage and fighting spirit could overcome technological advantages. In 30 feet of altitude, measured by miniature radios employing technology that German scientists had declared impossible, America announced that future warfare belonged entirely to those nations that could imagine innovations, engineer solutions, and mass-produce them reliably. Every German soldier who died under proximity fuse airburst died from American industrial philosophy made physically manifest, not through ideological superiority expressed in propaganda, but through engineering excellence, not through political rhetoric, but through production capacity, not through military theory, but through terminal ballistics reduced to mathematical precision. The shells that exploded precisely 30 feet above German foxholes delivered democracy's most effective argument against fascism in the form of supersonic steel fragments, proving conclusively that free societies could outproduce, out-innovate, and ultimately outfight totalitarian powers when fully mobilized for total war. The proximity fuse represented democracy's perfect weapon in many respects. It was simultaneously sophisticated, yet mass-produced, technically complex, yet operationally reliable, individually expensive, yet treated as expendable in combat. It killed with ruthless efficiency, not through hatred or ideology, but through pure engineering excellence applied systematically. It ended battles not through deliberate barbarism, but through superior mathematics and physics. It won wars not through cruelty for its own sake, but through overwhelming industrial capability deployed without restraint. The story of German infantry facing proximity fuses is fundamentally about the violent collision between past and future, between traditional warfare and industrial age combat. Traditional defensive techniques that had been perfected over centuries of European warfare became completely obsolete within minutes of first encountering this new technology. The earth itself, which had protected soldiers since organized warfare began in ancient times, could no longer provide effective shelter. The proximity fuse didn't merely kill German soldiers by the thousands. It killed an entire conception of how warfare functioned and how soldiers could protect themselves. In December 1944, German infantry had 30 feet of distance before proximity fuse airbursts shredded their foxholes and their bodies. In that brief physical distance lay the entire difference between the world that had existed and the world that was being created through industrial warfare. German soldiers measured their survival in meters of earth and depth of entrenchment. American industrial democracy measured its victory in megahertz of radio frequency and fragments per square yard. The future had arrived on European battlefields. It was being mass-produced in quantities that defied comprehension, and it exploded with perfect consistency at exactly 30 feet above the ground, transforming defensive warfare forever and demonstrating that America's industrial capacity, when fully mobilized and properly directed, represented an insurmountable advantage that no amount of traditional military skill could overcome. The proximity fuse killed German soldiers efficiently and in massive numbers, but more importantly, it killed Germany's last hopes that courage and tactical expertise could somehow compensate for America's overwhelming advantages in industrial production, scientific innovation, and systematic organization. In those 30 feet between detonation and impact, measured in microseconds and calculated by miniature radios, the Second World War's outcome became mathematically inevitable regardless of how many more months the fighting would continue.